having a pregnancy diagnosis. The same exact pattern we see with genetic technologies. So this technology absolutely works, and if you leave today with no other information than that, leave trusting and using EPDs. I grew up in northwest New Mexico. This is a picture from back when I was a teenager and had a lot more hair. I did my undergrad at New Mexico State, and one of the things Tim Ross used to always say is repetition is the language of scholars. And so because this concept of EPDs is so important, you're going to hear a lot of repetition in my talk from the previous talks. In my extension program, it's all about simply explaining genetic and genomic technologies to help farmers and ranchers better understand how to be more profitable. In my research program, which we'll talk a little bit at the end of my talk, it's about using the history of populations to create better DNA tests. So I think it's really important that, since we're going to be talking about EPDs, that we define what that acronym means. And it's really loaded with meaning. The most loaded word in that acronym is expected. And we're not using expected here the way maybe a lay person would use it. We're using it the way a statistician would use it, okay? And so when we're talking about expected, we're talking about a prediction of the future, but it also means that we're talking about an average or the mean, okay? So we're not talking about the performance of one data point. We're talking about the average of a group. And so what is that group? What is that average of the group that we're talking about? The average of that group is the progeny of the animal that we're looking at the EPDs on. It's the calf crop of that animal, okay? So that EPD is not necessarily a prediction of that animal's own performance. It's a prediction about how the average of his calf crop is going to perform compared to other calf crops. Finally, we're talking about a difference, okay? If I give you one EPD profile, and that's the only piece of information I give you, that information is worthless. We have to make a comparison with EPDs. So we're either going to compare two different bulls, or we're going to compare a bull to the breed average. So a lot of times we talk about performance as being this simple equation of genetics plus the environment, okay? So it can be, so it's this steer over here, and it's his genetics plus where he's at, his feed, vaccinations, other management things. This is really too simplistic of a model. There's much more going on there. We have additive genetics that are predictively inherited generation after generation. We have dominant genetics, which skew things from those additive effects. We have genetic interactions. We have genetic by environment interactions, the permanent environment, the temporary environment, etc., etc. What this means is that the performance of that animal does not equal its EPD. The EPD is only the additive genetics. All of these other things are going to affect the performance of that animal. But the really important thing here is that the additive genetics is what's going to be predictably passed on to the next generation. So when we're making selection decisions, like Dare said, we don't want to muddy the water with all of these other effects. We want to zoom in and focus on those additive genetics. So a lot of times I interact with people a lot on the web, online, and so when I'm here with you all today, you're going to be extremely polite and nobody's going to challenge me or call me an idiot. But when I get online, nobody pulls a punch online. And so I know exactly how you all feel about EPDs because I've heard it all online. And one of the things that I think people really get suspect about EPDs, they think is this black box, they don't understand it, it's somebody behind the curtain pulling all the strings. And that's not true, that's not accurate. One of the things that's a really key piece of information that we have to calculate an EPD is some measure of genetic similarity. So traditionally, that measure of genetic similarity has been pedigree information, okay? But what happens when we have some measure of genetic similarity, whether it's a DNA test or pedigree information, is it allows us to take that overall trait variation and split it into two piles, into two bell curves. We have all of the variation from things that is not additive genetics, and then we have the variation for additive genetics. Once we've made this split in that variation, now we can make our selection decisions based on genetics. When we go to a bull sale, we're not going to scoop up a handful of that dirt and bring it home from us. Or when we go to a bull sale, the breeder isn't sending us home with 2 tons of feed. What we're taking home with us at a bull sale is genetics. If that's what we're bringing home with us, is that's what the purpose to purchase that day, then our decisions really need to be based on genetic merit. One of the other things that I think is important to understand, and that will become more important as we see value-added programs come online, is that the average performance of that calf crop is predicted by the EPD. Okay? So that average performance of a set of calves is predicted by the EPD, and so that EPD does have predictive ability. I think it's helpful if we go through a diagram, and Dara went through this a little bit, but I'll go through it as well. So we've got the black bull over here, he's got an EPD of 2, gold bull over here, EPD of 22. Okay? That EPD of 22 doesn't really tell us much about that gold bull. But if we compare these two bulls, we see that the EPD difference there is 20 pounds. So in the same environment, the same ranch, the same management, all of those same things, we get 100 calves out of these two bulls. Okay? The average of the black bull, he weans 495 pounds, so right here. And the gold bull, his calf crop average is 515 pounds. That difference in that calf crop average is what that difference is predicting with the EPD. 20 pounds difference in the EPD, 20 pound difference in the calf crop averages. But it's important to note that some of these gold bull calves are going to underperform the black bull average, and some of these black bull calves are going to outperform the gold bull average. That's just the fact of the randomness that comes with inheritance, okay? We're always going to have these bell curves. What EPDs allow us to do is to move that bell curve whichever direction we want it to go. So do EPDs work? Let's talk about that. Let's actually look at some data. So we've talked this week about the Thompson Research Center in Missouri. We're going to talk about data on 760 calves born over several years, and all of the dams of these calves have been tested with the GeneMax Advantage test from Zoetis and AGI. Okay? So this is a DNA test, but it's just an EPD using a different form of genetic similarity. So what we see is that this GeneMax test significantly predicts differences in the performance of these calves. So we take the calf's performance and compare it to the cow's GeneMax score. And so a 1 point improvement in that GeneMax score relates to a ½ pound improvement in the calf's carcass weight. Okay, and it's very significant. We can also see this for weaning weight. So a 1 point improvement in the GeneMax score is about a ½ pound difference in the calf's weaning weight. A 1 point improvement in the maternal milk is about a ¼ pound improvement in the weaning weight. And both of these, again, are significant. So we can see as the GeneMax score increases, the weaning weight tends to increase as well. Another thing that we did in this analysis is we fit the effect of the sire. Okay, so here on the vertical axis, we have the sire group averages. Okay, so all of these calves are out of this sire. What is their average weaning weight? Okay, and then we compare that to the sire's weaning weight EPD. And what we see, and this is completely expected due to the principles of genetics, is a 1 pound improvement in the weaning weight EPD leads to a 1 pound improvement in the average of that bull's calf crop. Okay, so these EPDs are doing exactly what we expect them to do. Most of these bulls fit with that. There's a couple that don't match up with the expectation. These two are natural service sires that have low accuracy EPDs. This bull is a proven AI sire, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there. But one thing I want to note here is that with EPDs, we're in it for the long game. Okay? We're not trying to get a home run with one individual bull, but we're trying to make predictable decisions year after year after year. If we look at just the phenotypic trends over time, so how the performance of this herd is improving over time, we can look at that. So this is the birth year of these calves, and this is their weaning weight. So the actual weight, not an adjustment or an EPD. What we see is the performance of this herd is improving by about 1.5 pounds per year. Okay? So if we compare 1996 to 1997, that 1.5 pound improvement probably isn't that big of a deal. But the 30 pound improvement from 1996 to 2016 is a big deal. And we've not only done this for weaning weight, but we've improved birth weight, and that means that the calving ease has improved in this herd. We've improved the marbling, so a high percentage, over 30% sometimes, of the retained ownership steers from this herd are grading prime, and so we're improving that year after year. And the carcass weights are improving by about 4 pounds per year. All of this has been done by using EPDs when we're selecting sires, whether those be artificial insemination sires or the natural bulls that we use for cleanup in this herd. So again, EPDs work. When we say that they lead to improvements in performance, if you use them diligently year after year after year, they are going to improve. So in the title, it talks about crossbreeding a little bit. I'm not going to talk about crossbreeding a lot today, but EPDs fit into a crossbreeding system. How I would recommend that you use EPDs in a crossbreeding system is that you use the breed effects and the breed complementarity to decide which breeds you're going to use in your crossbreeding program. Then, once you've identified that you're going to use Brahman and Angus, or Hereford and Angus, or whatever your breed makeup may be, Angus and Limousin, whatever it may be, you then use the EPDs to pick the best animals from the breeds you're using in your crossbreeding program. So if we're using black baldies, we use EPDs to select the very best Angus bulls that we can find, and we use the EPDs to find the very best Hereford bulls that we can find. Let's talk about some of the considerations that you should take into mind when using EPDs in a commercial setting. So we're going to talk about traits without EPDs available, selection for optimal performance, multiple trait selection, and environmental stressors. Unfortunately, because data recording is limited, there's some traits that we don't yet have an EPD for. Some of the ones that really come to mind are structural soundness, some of the fertility traits, etc. What is really, so what you're left with as a commercial producer is you have to use visual appraisal or phenotypic selection in these situations. That's just where we're at, and until we get more data, that's where we're going to be at. But one of the things that I think is interesting is if we can look at some of the things that's happened on some of these new traits that are coming online. So this is data from the Hereford Association for their udder and teat EPDs. So can anybody tell me what happened here in 2009, 2010? What made this change in these genetic trends for udder and teat EPDs? So what happened is in 2009, they said, we're going to start a systematic data recording program for udder scores. And so Hereford breeders started collecting and turning in those udder scores. That EPD wasn't actually released till 2015. But what you can see is when we start collecting data and thinking about that trait, we see the genetic improvement start to happen. So we didn't see much improvement back here before 2009. We started using the data collection, and then in 2015 launched EPDs. This is for the research foot angle EPD from the Angus Association. And basically over time, the main trend is that genetic merit for foot angle hasn't been changing in Angus cattle, okay? And we see some fluctuations here over the last 2 decades. But what is actually going to change this is when we start recording data, reporting that data, and then ultimately producing an EPD for that trait. So we need more data for female fertility, male fertility, health, structure, feed efficiency, etc. Okay, let's talk about optimal performance. One of the things I hear complaints about is that EPDs lead to selection for maximums. That we get way off the rails and select for way too much. EPDs are just a tool, right? If I have a hammer, I can use that hammer to delicately hang a hook to hang a nice picture on. Or I can take that hammer and punch a bunch of holes in all the drywall and cause a lot of damage to this convention center, right? The EPD is just a tool, and it really matters how you're using it, okay? We really need to watch for selecting for extremes, especially for certain traits. We're getting reports on birth weights where we're getting calves that are really too small than optimal. So it's much better if we select on calving ease rather than the actual birth weight. And we're going to talk for a moment about milk and mature size. So Dave Lawman's group has done some research in Brangus cows, and they compared the sire's milk EPD to the actual milk production. They went out and milked by hand these Brangus cows. And what you see is that when that genetic merit for milk gets too high, those cows simply can't express their genetic potential. Part of that is when we get milk genetic potential higher, the internal organ sizes also increase. So the maintenance requirement increases, and we simply can't feed that cow enough to make her express her genetic merit for milk. And so milk is really one of those traits that we should be looking for a sweet spot. We don't want it too low. We definitely don't want it too high. Angus has this nice optimal milk module that you can look up online. But one of the things that we're seeing is that we're simply getting these milk EPDs too high. And if we're thinking about things from a systematic approach, it's not going to help our bottom line. Mature size. We've done a lot of work bending this end of the growth curve, especially in the Angus breed. We've done a tremendous job of identifying bulls that have low birth weights and high weaning weights. What we've not done is to try to bend this second part of the growth curve. We've just let mature weights continue to go up and up and up. And so the same breeding approaches, the same selection decisions that we use to bend that beginning of the growth curve, we can also use that to bend the end of the growth curve. So to find animals who produce calves that have high yearling weights, but moderate mature sizes. Multiple trait selection. So we can all think about the last 50 years of beef cattle breeding, and we know the problems that come from single trait selection, right? So we know the dwarfism that came in the 60s, we know the elephants that came in the 80s. Whenever we chase these single traits, we end up in a bind and in a headache. So then the question is, what is the most important trait? So throw out some ideas. What are some of the most important traits in beef cattle production? And I'm patient, so I'll wait for answers. Reproduction, weaning weight, any other ideas? Calving ease. So all of those traits that you've identified lead into my answer and feed into my answer. And this is an answer that I didn't think of myself, but was given to me by Mike McNeil. The most important trait in beef cattle production is profit. Right? It's that simple. The most important trait in beef cattle production is profit. And so weaning weight is important in terms of how it affects our profitability. Reproduction is important, how it feeds into our profitability. Calving ease is important as it affects our profitability. Now we have EPDs for weaning weight, reproduction, calving ease, etc. Do we have an EPD for profit? And the answer is yes, we do. It's called an economic selection index. These are one of the tools, as Dare talked about, really simplify things for a commercial producer. If we open up a typical wholesale catalog, there's going to be 20, 30 pieces of information on each individual bull. For me personally, that's information overload. But when I can zero in and look at that economic selection index that combines all those pieces of information together, it really simplifies things and it focuses our selection on our profitability. Let's talk about environmental stressors. What happens is we have gene by environment interactions that cause the progeny of some bulls to perform really well in one environment, but the progeny from that same bull perform really poorly in a different environment. What this causes is the ranking that we would create in one environment is different from the ranking that we would create in a different environment. Okay? So you in the desert Southwest are familiar with this. If there's a bull who has too much performance or his daughters can't deal with the heat and the arid climate here, they don't perform very well. Where I'm at in Missouri, we have toxic fescue. If you don't know much about toxic fescue, it really causes a lot of adverse consequences for those cattle. The low-tech solution, where we're basically at right now, is when you buy genetics, whether it's an AI sire or whether it's a cleanup bull, you want to buy those genetics from an environment that's similar from your production setting. So if you're here in New Mexico, you're going to be looking at buying genetics from Arizona or New Mexico or perhaps the western part of Texas. If you're where I'm at in Missouri, I'm going to be looking at genetics in Virginia, South Carolina, Missouri, etc. The high-tech solution that my group is working on and other groups are working on is region-specific EPDs. So these are EPDs that are not a national evaluation, but an evaluation tailored to a specific challenging environment. So we have USDA funding for this project. You can look up this project on my blog and it'll tell you a little bit about the motivation for this. But basically what we do in all of our analyses in this research project is we took precipitation, temperature, and elevation data, combined it together, and split the United States up into 9 different regions. And so now, instead of comparing cattle all across the US, we're comparing them within a region, and we're comparing the regions to one another. This is a genomic prediction, so a genomic enhanced EPD that we did with some Gelbvieh data, so about 10,000 Gelbvieh animals, and we create genetic predictions for birth weight in region 3, region 9, and region 8. These are the 3 regions that we have the most numbers of animals in. And so these genetic predictions, these genomic predictions, are all quite accurate. They're something that would allow us to make rapid genetic progress, okay? But what's interesting is how different the genetic rankings from these region-specific EPDs are. So if we compare region 9 and region 3, these 2 regions, they give us fairly similar rankings. So these are Pearson correlations down here, and these are Spearman correlations up here. So the Pearson correlations are going to look at the magnitude of the differences. The Spearman correlations are going to look at that re-ranking. And so region 3 and region 9 give us very similar answers, but when we compare region 8, which is the fescue belt, to these other 2 regions, there's a substantial amount of re-ranking there. And so we're really excited about this project and the prototypes of region-specific EPDs that are going to come from it. So we've had lots of speakers today. One of the things I'd like to do now is to invite some audience participation. So I'd like somebody to come up and explain how a cell phone works. Who wants to explain how a cell phone works? Should I pick on my mom and make her do it? No. None of us really know how a cell phone works. We don't know the how, but we know that it does work. When I want to look up a bull's EPDs, I can get it online. When I want to send a text message or make a phone call, when I want to share a cute picture of my kids, the cell phone gets the job done. A lot of the technologies that we've talked about this week, especially genomic enhanced EPDs, EPDs, and indexes, you all don't need to know the nuts and bolts of how they work. What you all need to know is that they do work. You can use these tools to help you identify more profitable cattle so that your operation is sustainable. I think about my grandfather a lot and how successful he was in the cattle business and the traditions that he left me. But I also think about my kids, and I want there to be a strong and vibrant beef industry for them to be a part of. The issue is, if we don't start adopting technology, there won't be a viable beef industry. It won't be there. So academics like myself have made the mistake of making genetics seem too complicated. We're working on fixing that and explaining it to you all in simple terms. But you all have a responsibility to the next generation. You need to identify ways that you can improve and change your operation to be more sustainable going forward. Don't do it for yourself. Do it for that next generation so they can be part of it. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions you all may have.